Hi everyone, my name is Megan Torres. I'm 34 years old. I live in a small house in Ohio with my husband Daniel, two cats named Biscuit and Fig, a half-dead fern I refuse to throw away because it survived longer than most things in my life, and a little pink bedroom at the end of the hallway that I haven't been able to repaint yet. Her name was Lily. She was 6 days old when she died, and before I start this story, I need you to hold on to something, because without it, what I'm about to share might just sound like family drama, like something petty and ordinary, the kind of thing people say you should eventually get over. It's not that. What my sister did on the day we buried my child was the single most cruel thing anyone has ever done to me. Not because she's an evil person. I actually don't think she is. I think she's something more complicated than that, and more common. Someone who has spent her whole life at the center of every room, who was never once asked to move aside, and who, when she finally needed to, simply didn't know how. But the cruelty was real, and what made it worse, what still catches me sometimes, at 2 in the morning, in a way that makes me stare at the ceiling, is that half the room smiled and clapped. So, this is my story, and I promise you, every word of it is true. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand where I came from to understand any of what happened later. Growing up in the Torres household was complicated in the specific way that families with favorites are always complicated. My parents, Maria and Roberto Torres, were warm people in a lot of ways. They worked hard. My dad was a mechanic who smelled like motor oil and came home tired and still made it to every school play. My mom cooked enormous meals and kept photo albums and said I love you at the end of every phone call. They weren't neglectful or cruel. They were parents who genuinely tried, but there was always a difference. Between me and Kayla, there was always a difference. I was the oldest by 4 years. I was the responsible one, the quiet one. The one who got good grades and didn't cause scenes, and cleared the table without being asked, and remembered birthdays, and never needed to be told twice. My mom used to call me her little helper, and when you're 7, that sounds sweet, but when you're 10, and 12, and 15, it starts to feel less like a compliment, and more like an assigned role. Like someone looked at you when you were very small, and decided, this one will be reliable, this one will not require much. Kayla was everything else. She was loud and funny, and she had this laugh, this ridiculous, full-body laugh that made strangers on the street turn to look, and she commanded every room she walked into without any apparent effort. She was the one who could talk to adults like an equal at age 8. She was the one who got cast as the lead in the school play every single time. She was the one whose stories at the dinner table made my dad lean back and laugh until his eyes watered. I am not going to stand here and pretend I wasn't charmed by her, because I was. She was my little sister, and I loved her. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever happened later, I loved her first. But love doesn't make favoritism invisible. It was in the small things, always. The way my mom's face transformed when Kayla walked into a room, not just soft like it was with me, but actually lit up, surprised and delighted, like Kayla was a gift that kept being given. The way my dad would explode in laughter at Kayla's jokes and nod politely at mine. The way Kayla got the bigger bedroom without discussion when we moved to the new house. The way her birthday parties had themes and guests and decorations, and mine had dinner out, which is fine, which is a completely acceptable way to celebrate a birthday, but is also a different thing. I didn't have vocabulary for what I was experiencing when I was young. I just had the feeling, a low, persistent hum beneath everything, like a frequency you can't quite hear but can always sense. The feeling of being slightly less, not unloved, just less central, less urgent, less the point. By the time I was in high school, I had built a whole interior life around not needing too much from them, because needing things and not having them met is more painful than teaching yourself not to need them in the first place. I excelled in school because it was something I could control. I had a small, tight group of friends. I read constantly. I kept my room very clean. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State and paid for my own books with the money I'd saved from 3 years of waitressing. I graduated in 3.5 years with honors. I moved into a small apartment with 2 roommates and a radiator that clinked all winter, and I was happy in a way that felt genuinely earned because I had built it myself. I met Daniel at a college friend's going-away party my senior year. He was standing near the kitchen, holding a drink, clearly not knowing anyone either, and he had this expression on his face that I immediately recognized, the particular look of someone who is comfortable being quiet. I introduced myself, and he smiled, and later he told me that the first thing he noticed about me was that when I talked to people, I actually looked at them like I was paying real attention. That is still one of the nicest things anyone has ever said to me. We dated for 3 years. We got engaged in the kitchen of our first apartment with no ring because he'd spent the money on rent, and he got down on one knee on the linoleum floor, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married when I was 26. Small ceremony, his family, my family, a handful of close friends, a backyard in September, sunflowers, a cake we picked out together from a bakery and transported in the back seat of Daniel's car while I held it with both hands and he drove 15 miles an hour the whole way. Kayla was my maid of honor. She gave a speech at the reception that was, genuinely, about 70% her own life story and 30% about how great it was that Daniel put up with Megan's intensity. Everybody laughed. My dad laughed. My mom dabbed her eyes in a fond way. I laughed too, because that's what you do, and because at the time, I still believed the best version of Kayla, still told myself she was just being funny, just nervous, just a little much, but also lovable. I understand now that what I was doing in those moments, all those years of laughing at the jokes that minimized me, all those years of nodding along while the room orbited her, was a survival mechanism I'd developed so gradually I couldn't even feel it anymore. You don't notice when water gets warm, you just notice when it starts to boil. Daniel and I wanted children. We had talked about it before we got married, honestly, and specifically in the way that people who've been hurt before know to talk about things. We both wanted 2, maybe 3. We wanted a house with a yard. We wanted a dog eventually. He wanted a girl first because he'd grown up with 3 brothers and thought the experience might round him out. I told him I didn't care about the gender, which was true, but I secretly also wanted a girl. We started trying when I was 28. It didn't work. Month after month, nothing. I tracked my cycle obsessively. I cut out caffeine and alcohol and started taking supplements that the internet insisted would help. I made Daniel switch to boxers. I lay with my feet up the wall after every attempt because someone on a forum said it worked for them. Nothing. At 12 months, we saw a specialist. At 18 months, we did our first round of IUI. At 20 months, we did our first round of IVF. That IVF cycle failed. If you've been through fertility treatment, you know what that costs. Not just financially, though it does cost financially more than I want to think about, but emotionally. The injections you give yourself every morning, the bloating and the mood swings, and the way you start to feel like your body is both a project you're working on and a source of constant disappointment. The monitoring appointments where you lie on a table and stare at a screen trying to read the sonographer's expression. The phone call from the nurse. The specific, cold way the words land when they tell you it didn't work. I cried in a pharmacy parking lot 4 separate times during those 2 years. Not because pharmacies are particularly emotional places, but because that's where I kept stopping after appointments, in the car, before I could drive home, needing somewhere to fall apart before I had to be okay again. Daniel held me through all of it in a way that I don't think he gets enough credit for. He never rushed me through grief. He never said anything about timing or silver linings. He just stayed. He made dinner on the bad nights, and he sat with me on the bathroom floor when I needed to sit on the bathroom floor, and he cried with me when I needed him to cry. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, 16 months after we started fertility treatment, The test was positive. I sat on that bathroom floor again, this time with the positive test in my hand, and I shook from head to toe, not from cold, not from fear, from the specific, overwhelming fullness of something you've wanted so desperately suddenly being real. Daniel was getting dressed for work when I called to him. He came to the bathroom doorway and I held up the test without saying anything, and he sat down on the floor next to me, still in his work clothes, and we just held each other on the cold tile for a long time. She wasn't named yet. She was barely the size of a blueberry, but she was real. She was finally, impossibly real. We kept the pregnancy quiet for the first trimester, cautious, given everything. At 13 weeks, when we'd seen the heartbeat 3 times and things looked stable, we made calls. We told Daniel's parents first, over video from Colorado, and his mom pressed her hands to her mouth and cried so hard she couldn't talk for a full minute. Then we called mine. Kayla was at my parents' house when we did it. My mom had her in video too. All of us connected in this little grid of faces. My mom cried. My dad said mi amor in this cracked, quiet voice I hadn't heard him use before. And Kayla, who was sitting on their couch with a cup of coffee, literally shrieked and stood up, and the camera shook from the movement. I'm going to be the absolute best aunt, she announced, leaning toward the phone. I'm already planning. Don't try to stop me. I've been looking at nursery themes for a year. Do not make any decisions without consulting me. I laughed. I genuinely laughed. She was so delighted, so warm, so completely present in that moment. And I thought, okay, this is what she's like when she's happy for someone else. This is the Kayla I always wanted her to be. The pregnancy was hard in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even after all the preparation. Hyperemesis gravidarum hit me the first trimester like a truck. Constant, violent nausea that left me unable to keep water down. I lost 8 pounds. I missed 2 weeks of work. I lay on the bathroom floor more times than I can count. Daniel bringing me ice chips and damp washcloths while I breathed through the ceiling. Second trimester brought a scare with low amniotic fluid that sent us to the hospital at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. We sat in a monitoring room for 5 hours while nurses checked and rechecked and eventually sent us home with instructions to come back immediately if anything changed. Neither of us slept for the next 3 days. But Lily kept growing. We found out she was a girl at 20 weeks. I had told myself I didn't have a preference, and maybe I didn't. But when the sonographer said, it's a girl, I felt something specific and warm and knowing, like of course she is. We painted her room the softest pink I'd ever seen, a color called Rose Whisper that looked almost white in daylight and deepened at dusk. Daniel built the crib himself over 3 weekends, the manual spread across the living room floor, tools arranged in neat rows, the way he does everything. I came home on a Sunday afternoon to find him on the floor with the drill, completely absorbed, sawdust on his jeans, and I stood in the doorway watching him and thought, he is going to be such a good dad. It hit me so hard I had to press my hand to my mouth. I bought the duck socks at 25 weeks. You know those little baby socks with the tiny rubber dots on the bottom so they don't slip? They had ducks on them. I found them at a drugstore in the baby aisle, and they were so small I could hold both of them in one palm, and I stood there in the aisle for a full minute before I put them in my basket. At 36 weeks, a routine scan found something. The sonographer's face changed first, just slightly, just enough. The way a person's face shifts when they're about to give you information they wish they didn't have. A heart defect, hypoplastic left heart syndrome. The left side of the heart was severely underdeveloped, not just a small abnormality, but a significant structural issue that would require intervention. The maternal fetal medicine specialist we saw 2 days later was careful and thorough and kind. She explained it fully. She answered every question we had and several we didn't think to ask. She said there were options: a staged surgical repair beginning shortly after birth, a possible transplant list later in life, palliative care if the family chose that path. She said some children with this condition had good outcomes. She said it was serious, and she didn't want to minimize it. I held Daniel's hand through the entire appointment, and didn't cry until we got to the parking garage, and then I cried for 20 minutes in the car, ugly and desperate, before I dried my face and said, "Okay, tell me what we need to do." Because what else do you do? She was already Lily by then. We had already named her. She was already the person who would be born into that pink room with the crib Daniel built, and the duck socks, and the elephant mobile that played "You Are My Sunshine," which was the only song I knew all the words to, and had sung to her through my stomach for 3 months. She was already mine. You don't decide not to love someone because the road ahead is hard. She was born on a Thursday morning in March. I was in labor for 17 hours. There were specialists in the room. The atmosphere was controlled and tense in the way that delivery rooms sometimes are. Not chaotic, but deliberately focused, everyone doing exactly what they were trained to do. And then she was here. She was perfect. She was 6 pounds and 11 ounces. And she had Daniel's nose and my forehead and the most impossibly tiny fingers. She cried once, loud and clear, and then went quiet when they placed her against my chest, and she blinked at me with those unfocused, newborn eyes, dark and wide and searching, and I talked to her immediately, like I'd been rehearsing. I told her my name. I told her I was her mom. I told her she had been so wanted. I told her she was the most important thing that had ever happened to me, and that I was going to be right there. She looked at me the whole time I talked. She lived for 6 days. The surgical team was excellent. The first procedure was attempted on day 3, and there were complications. Her body was too small, her vessels too fragile, and despite everything the team did and everything that medicine could offer, her heart on the 6th night simply stopped. I was holding her, both arms wrapped around her, the soft weight of her against my chest, Daniel's arms around both of us. And she went still. There are no words for that. I've tried to find them many times, in journals and in therapy, and in conversations with other mothers who have been where I was, and I have never found them. The language doesn't exist for what it is to hold your child in the moment she leaves. The days after are a blur I've reconstructed through Daniel's recollections and photographs, and what other people have told me. I know that Daniel handled the calls. I know that my mother arrived the next morning and stood in my kitchen and sobbed so hard she couldn't breathe. I know that flowers came from people I hadn't thought about in years. I know that my neighbor left a casserole on the front porch without knocking. We chose a small white casket. That is a sentence I never thought I would type. The night Lily died, at around 11 o'clock, Kayla called. She was crying. She said she couldn't believe it. She said she was devastated. She said she loved us both so much, and she would be there for anything we needed. "Let me handle the reception," she said. "You and Daniel just focus on getting through these next few days. I will take care of everything. That's what I'm here for." I thanked her and meant it. My whole body was numb, and I was grateful for anything that reduced the number of things I had to think about. I should have known. I have thought about that phone call many times since then. The warmth of it, the genuine sounding concern, and I wonder whether she planned it already in that moment, or whether the idea came to her later. I don't know. I'll never know. But I should have known that Kayla offering to organize something was not an act of service. It was an act of access. We buried Lily on a gray Tuesday morning. The church was full, more full than I'd expected. I'd thought it might be a small service. Who comes to bury a baby who never had the chance to become a person most people knew? But they came. Her neonatal nurses came. My coworkers came. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to came. Old friends I'd lost touch with drove hours. They came because they understood something about loss that transcends the length of a life. They came for Daniel and for me. I sat in the front pew between my mother and my husband, holding a single white rose that kept trembling slightly because my hands wouldn't stop. The pastor spoke about small souls and about heaven and about how love doesn't require time to be real. I stared at the tiny white casket and thought about "You Are My Sunshine" and duck socks and the room at the end of the hallway and the way she had blinked at me that first morning like she was trying to solve a mystery. Kayla sat in the second row. At one point, I glanced back at her and she was typing on her phone. I thought she was probably coordinating the reception. I thought she was being helpful. I turned back around. The reception was at my parents' house, because that is where these things happen, where people gather after grief with covered dishes and gentle voices and the slow, numb work of existing in the aftermath. My mother had arranged food. There were flowers on every surface. Someone, I don't know who, I later found out it was my cousin Rachel, had framed a photograph of Lily from the hospital, the one where she was sleeping with her face turned slightly sideways, impossibly small and impossibly peaceful, and placed it near the front door so that everyone who walked in would see her first. I moved through that afternoon the way you move through water when you're very tired. I hugged people. I said thank you. I accepted condolences. I excused myself to the bathroom twice to cry against the towel bar until I could reassemble my face. About 2 hours in, I was standing near the kitchen doorway talking to an old family friend when I heard it, the clink of a fork against glass. You know that sound. Everyone knows that sound. It's a sound you hear at weddings. It means, pay attention, something is about to happen. I turned. Kayla was standing in the middle of the living room. She was wearing a dark dress. Appropriately, I had noticed that much, and her cheeks were flushed, and she was holding a glass of what I assumed was sparkling water. The room went quiet. 30, maybe 35 people looking at her. I know today has been so incredibly hard, she started. Her voice was soft, practiced. And I love Megan and Daniel more than I can say. I want them to know that Lily was so beautiful, so loved, so real. Murmurs moved through the room. People nodded. My mother pressed her hand to her chest. And actually, Kayla said, and her expression shifted just slightly. I've been carrying some news for a while now. I didn't want to say anything before today because today was about Lily, but I also thought, after all this sadness, maybe we could use something hopeful, something to look forward to, something that feels like... She paused for effect. I watched her do it. I watched her feel the room's attention. Ryan and I are expecting a baby. The room erupted, not in confusion, not in uncomfortable silence, in joy. There was an audible collective gasp, and then, I promise you on everything I have, there was applause. People turned to each other with bright, startled faces. My aunt covered her mouth with both hands. 2 of my mother's friends grabbed each other's arms. An elderly neighbor said, loudly, "Oh, how wonderful, how absolutely wonderful." My father started laughing, with the involuntary reflex of a man who had just been told good news without pausing to consider the context. And I stood there, in the room where we had gathered to mourn my 6-day-old daughter, and I watched 30 people celebrate my sister's pregnancy. I want you to really sit with this, because I need you to understand the geometry of it. We had buried Lily 4 hours ago. Her photograph was right there, next to the front door, visible from where I was standing. The white flowers my mother had arranged were funeral flowers. The casserole dishes on the counter were sympathy food. And my sister was standing in the middle of all of it, clinking a glass, making an announcement. Daniel's hand found my arm. He had crossed the room from wherever he was without me seeing him move. He put his hand on my arm and didn't say anything, just stood there, and I understood from the pressure of his grip that he was feeling what I was feeling, and that he was the only other person in the room who was. Kayla looked at me across the crowd, and she smiled. I've replayed that smile more times than I can count. It wasn't guilty. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't the smile of someone who had just realized they might have made a mistake. It was the smile of someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted. The specific smile of someone who had been the center of a room. I have to be honest with you. Let me pause here for a second. Because after I told this story to a few people who hadn't grown up in families like mine, people who didn't understand the particular architecture of being the other sibling, they asked me if maybe Kayla hadn't realized what she was doing, if maybe she was just excited, thoughtless, genuinely trying to bring something positive. I need to answer that honestly. No, Kayla had planned it. She had clinked a glass. She had written what she wanted to say. I know because the rhythm of it was too smooth to be improvised, the pause too deliberate. She knew what day it was. She knew whose funeral we had just attended. She was not a thoughtless or unintelligent person. She was a person who had spent her entire life making strategic decisions about how to maximize attention, who had never had to pay a real cost for those decisions, and who, in this particular moment, had made the calculated choice that the room's attention, even a room gathered in my grief, was hers to take. And she was right, because we had all, for years, let her be right. My mother found me about 20 minutes later. I had retreated to the hallway. I was sitting on the stairs, Daniel crouched in front of me, both of us just breathing. My mother came around the corner and saw us, and her face did something complicated. "Megan," she said, careful, measured. "You know Kayla didn't mean any harm." I looked at her. "She was honestly so worried about how to share the news," my mother continued. "She told me she didn't want to make things harder. She thought maybe it would give people something positive to hold on to after." "Mom," I said, "we are at Lily's funeral reception." "I know, sweetheart. We buried Lily 4 hours ago. There is a photograph of her next to the front door." I know that, and I know you're hurting." She stood up and announced her pregnancy. "In this room, on this day," while everyone applauded, my mother pressed her lips together. "Kayla is pregnant, and that is also real, and she can't change the timing of. She can change when she announces it," I said. "She could have called me tomorrow. She could have waited 1 single day. She wanted everyone together. She thought the community of it." I stood up. I looked at my mother, who had raised me, who had always loved me, who was standing in this hallway telling me that the woman who had just hijacked my child's funeral reception had merely been trying to bring people together. And I thought, she will never see it. She is not capable of seeing it. Not today. "I'm going home," I said. I didn't say goodbye to Kayla. I couldn't look at her. Daniel got our coats and we left, and I sat in the passenger seat of the car and stared out the window at the grey March sky the whole drive home and didn't say a single word. What followed that day was a long, grinding process of realizing that almost everyone I loved was going to fail me in their own specific way. My Aunt Linda, who was my mother's sister and the person in the family I had always trusted most, called me 3 days after the funeral and said simply, "What she did was wrong. I need you to hear someone in this family say that clearly." And she said it, and I needed it more than I expected to. But she was the exception. My mother called every few days in the weeks after the funeral. She checked on me. She said the right words about grief. But almost every call somehow found its way to Kayla, how she was doing with the pregnancy, how she was feeling, how everyone was so excited. I don't think my mother was doing it deliberately. I think it was just the groove that had been worn into the family floor for 30 years, and she walked it without thinking. About 3 weeks after the funeral, she called to tell me there was going to be a gender reveal party for Kayla, and that she hoped I'd be there. I told her I wouldn't be coming. The silence on the line was sharp and specific, the silence of someone who expected a different answer and is recalculating. "Megan," she said, "I understand you're hurting, but this is your sister. I'm aware of who she is." She's apologized. I stopped moving when she said that. I was in the kitchen, unloading the dishwasher, and I just stopped, set a plate down very carefully. When did she apologize? She told me she's sorry if you were hurt by the timing. There it was. Sorry if you were hurt. Not, I am sorry for what I did. Not, I was wrong to do that. Not, there is no version of what I did that was acceptable. Sorry if you were hurt, which translates, in the language of people who cannot fully own their choices, to, I regret that your sensitivity made this situation difficult. That's not an apology, Mom, I said. Megan, an apology is, I did something wrong and I'm sorry. What she told you is a conditional statement about my feelings. Those are different things. Another silence. I think, my mother said carefully, that you might need some more time before you can hear what she's trying to say. And I realized then that nothing I said was going to land. Not yet. Not from where my mother was standing. Because my mother had been Kayla's chief defender for 30 years, and you don't undo 30 years of a reflex in one phone call, no matter how right you are. I told her I needed space. She told me she hoped I would think about it. We said goodbye in the polite, formal way that means nothing is resolved. I started therapy 6 weeks after the funeral. My therapist, Dr. Singh, was a small, precise woman with wireframe glasses and an office full of plants who asked questions in a particular way, not leading, just open and specific, that made you see things you'd been standing too close to. In our third session, she said something I've thought about almost every week since. Tell me about growing up in your family, not the Lily story. Before that. And I told her, all of it, the bedroom and the birthday parties and the dinner table laughs and the scholarship I paid myself and the way I had watched, for 3 decades, the air in every room shift when Kayla walked in. Dr. Singh listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You've been trained to minimize your needs so consistently that making space for Kayla has become your default setting. You don't even feel yourself doing it anymore. The funeral was that dynamic at its most extreme. She needed attention, you were in pain, and no one said stop. But the structure that made that possible had been in place your whole life." I sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the silence stretched, and she let it. I kept thinking, I finally said, that if I could just explain it clearly enough, they would understand. If I said the right words in the right order, my mom would hear me. And what happened when you tried? She defended Kayla. What does that tell you? I looked at her plants for a moment. That it's not about my words, it's about what they're willing to see. She nodded very slightly in the way she did when you got to something real. 8 months after the funeral, Kayla's baby was born. A boy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, named James. My parents were at the hospital. Photos appeared on social media. My mother holding him, my father with his face doing something private and full. My mother posted something about being the luckiest grandmother in the world, in the comments filled with hearts, and I sat in Lily's room looking at my phone and felt something that wasn't jealousy exactly, but lived right next door to it. That same evening, Kayla called me, for the first time since the funeral. "I wanted you to know James is here," she said, soft, tired, the specific exhaustion of someone who has just done the hardest work a body can do. "He's perfect. I just wanted you to know." I let a moment pass. "Kayla," I said, "I need to ask you something." "Okay. Why did you do it?" "At the reception. Why that moment?" A pause. "Megan, please don't say you didn't think. You thought. You planned what you were going to say. You clinked the glass. You stood in the middle of the room. I was excited, and everyone was so sad, and I thought, you thought it would help? I thought something hopeful. Kayla, stop." My voice was quiet, not angry, just done. "I need to ask you something else. When you looked at me across that room, after you announced it, what did you feel?" A very long silence. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think you do." More silence. "I needed them to be happy for me," she said. Her voice dropped. "I know that's not what you want to hear. I'd been holding the news for so long, and I kept waiting for the right moment, and I thought, everyone is already sad, maybe this could help. But also I needed it. I needed them to look at me. I needed them to be happy. I closed my eyes. She needed it. That was the whole answer, distilled to its simplest form. She needed to be looked at. She needed the room's attention. And the fact that the room was full of people gathered to mourn my dead child was not, in the end, enough to stop her. I hear you, I said. Megan, I'm sorry. I know I have to go, I said, and I hung up. I sat for a long time in Lily's room with the phone in my lap. I could hear Daniel in the kitchen, the refrigerator humming. Outside, a dog barking somewhere down the street. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it was before that call, and also completely changed. Then I picked up the phone, and I called my mother, and I said, Mom, I need to tell you some things, and I need you to actually try to hear them. That call lasted 2 hours and 7 minutes. I know because I checked later. I told her everything, not just about the funeral, though I told her about that too, in a way I hadn't before. Specifically, and without softening. I told her about the childhood. I told her about the bedroom and the birthday parties and the way I had watched for 30 years as the air in every room shifted toward Kayla. I told her about learning to need very little because needing more was too painful. I told her about building my entire life around self-sufficiency because I had figured out very early that there was a limit to how much of the family's attention and energy belonged to me. I told her all of it, not angrily, not accusatorially, though she might have felt accused. Just honestly, in the way that you eventually have to be honest with someone you love who has hurt you, if there is any chance of something real surviving. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, I didn't know you felt all of that. And I said, That's not an accident, Mom. I learned to feel things quietly. She cried, the kind of crying that doesn't have a lot of sound to it, just breathing that breaks. I let her cry. I didn't comfort her, not because I was being cruel, but because I thought she needed to sit in it for a minute. I don't know if I can fix it, she said finally. I don't know how to go back and undo what we did. I don't know if I'm sorry is enough. It's not enough, I said, but it's the beginning. Here is where I need to tell you something about what happened to Kayla after she stopped having me as a counterpoint. Because this is the part people don't always understand about family systems. When you remove someone who has always made space, who has absorbed friction and smoothed things over, and made the other person's needs feel manageable by consistently managing their own, what you find is that the other person's needs don't shrink, they expand. Without me in the family dynamic, without the friction between us that had structured so many family conversations, Kayla had to be entirely who she was on her own terms. And who she was, it turned out, was a person whose needs had no bottom. I heard this slowly, through my Aunt Linda, through my cousin Rachel, and eventually through my mother herself. The reports were gentle and careful at first, delivered in the tone people use when they're being loyal to someone, while also not quite being able to defend them. Kayla had expected my parents to be at her house multiple times a week after James was born. When my father had a prior commitment one Saturday and couldn't come, she stopped speaking to him for 4 days. When my mother suggested gently that maybe Kayla could try to get James on a more predictable sleep schedule, Kayla told her she was being unsupportive and controlling. She posted long, emotional captions on social media about how lonely motherhood felt, how isolating, how no one really understood what she was going through. And when people responded with sympathy and support, she posted more. The posts got more elaborate. She described herself as completely on her own, in a way that confused people who knew my parents were there multiple times a week. Ryan, her husband, looked exhausted in every photo. My mother told me about all of this slowly, piece by piece, over the phone, and I could hear in her voice the specific discomfort of someone who is starting to see something they don't want to see but can't quite look away from. And then Kayla announced on social media that she and Ryan were trying for a second baby. The announcement was made on what would have been Lily's second birthday. I don't know if she did it deliberately. I have turned that question over many times, and I still don't know. What I know is that she knew what day it was. She had been in the family long enough to know that date, to know its weight, and she posted it anyway. My mother called me that morning. Her voice was different. "She knows what day it is," my mother said. "Yes," I said. "Does she do this on purpose? I keep trying to..." She stopped, started again. "I keep trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, and I don't know if I can anymore." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Mom, I've been asking myself that question for 2 years." She said, "I should have said something at the reception that day. I should have stepped in." "Yes," I said, "you should have." Another pause. "I didn't protect you," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 years, Megan. I didn't protect you when you needed it. I let that sit." "I love you more than I know how to say," she said. "I know," I said. "I know you do." It was the truest thing she had said in 2 years. Let me tell you about the dinner that changed things for real. About a month after that phone call, my parents asked if Daniel and I would come for dinner. Just us. They were specific about that. Just us. We went. My mother made rice and chicken the way she'd made it my whole life, and it smelled like something that existed before all of this. My dad hugged me at the door for a long time, not saying anything, and then held me at arm's length and looked at my face like he was checking to see how I was and was afraid of the answer. We sat around the table and talked in a way we hadn't in years. About Lily, about Daniel and me, what we'd been doing, how we'd been managing. About Clara, who was not yet born, but who we had started, carefully, to hope for again. At some point my father put down his fork and said, "Your mother and I have been having some hard conversations." "About Kayla," my mother said. "About ourselves," my father said. "About choices we made, things we saw and didn't call out. A way of treating you that we told ourselves was fine, because you seemed fine." I held very still. "We told her," my mother said. "We sat down with her and we told her that what she did at Lily's reception was wrong. That we should have said so the day it happened. That we were sorry we hadn't." "How did she respond?" I asked. My parents looked at each other. "She said we were ganging up on her," my father said quietly. "She said we were choosing you over her," my mother added. "She said she was going through a lot, and she couldn't believe we were doing this to her." "Then she stopped speaking to us," my father said. "For 6 weeks. 6 weeks of silence from a daughter, for the smallest, most overdue request for accountability." I looked at my parents, at my father who had spent 30 years being charmed by Kayla's laugh, and my mother who had spent 30 years being her fiercest defender. And I saw something in both of their faces that I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific tiredness of someone who has finally looked squarely at something they've been looking slightly past for a very long time. "I know this is hard," I said. "It is," my mother said. "She's our daughter. She'll always be our daughter, but we're starting to understand something about what we've been doing all these years, and it is not comfortable to understand it." My father put his hand over mine on the table. "We are sorry," he said, "for letting you carry it for as long as you did." I cried. My mom cried. My father cried, which I had seen twice in my entire life, and Daniel went to the kitchen and came back with ice cream. Because Daniel always knows when a moment needs ice cream, and somehow that was the most human and correct thing that had happened at a family dinner in years. We tried again. I want to talk about this because I think it's important, because people sometimes imagine that after a loss like ours, the decision to try again is simple, driven by hope, cleaned up by time. It isn't. It is terrifying in a way that doesn't get less terrifying just because you want it badly enough. Daniel and I talked about it for months. In therapy, in the dark, at the kitchen table over coffee, in the early morning before either of us had to be anywhere. The thing we kept coming back to was this. The love we had for Lily had nowhere to go. It sat in us, enormous and full, and it needed somewhere. And the pink bedroom was still there, and the duck socks were still in the drawer, and You Are My Sunshine was still on the mobile. We tried again at 32. There were 2 early losses. There was another round of IVF. There were more parking lots. There was a night in the spring when I sat on the bathroom floor and told Daniel I didn't think I could do it again, and he sat down next to me and said, "Okay, whatever you decide is the right decision, and I will be here for it." I tried again. At 33 weeks, I was lying in a hospital monitoring room, staring at a heartbeat on a screen that was not my own, and a nurse came in and said everything looked perfect. Our daughter was born at 38 weeks. She was pink and furious and screaming, and her heart was completely, perfectly healthy, and she had 10 fingers and 10 toes and my mother's nose, which I only noticed later because in the moment all I could see was her. We named her Clara. We brought her home to the pink room with the rose whisper walls. We put the mobile up. We put the duck socks in the drawer. The first night home, when the house was quiet and Daniel was asleep and Clara was against my chest in the rocking chair, I talked to Lily. I told her about her sister. I told her Clara had her forehead. I told her the mobile still played her song. I told her she was still the first. And that first was a thing no one could ever take. I told her I loved her. I still talk to her. I probably always will. Kayla and I don't have a relationship anymore. I want to be honest about what that looks like because people expect a particular kind of ending. The dramatic confrontation or the tearful reconciliation. What happened was quieter than either. I wrote her a letter, 3 drafts over 3 months before I sent it. I told her I didn't want contact. I told her I didn't hate her. I told her I genuinely believed she was capable someday of understanding the weight of what she had done, but that I couldn't sustain myself on the hope of that understanding while it didn't come. That I needed to choose my own peace more than I needed to preserve a relationship that cost me more than I had. She didn't respond for 2 months. When she finally did, she sent a text message, not a call, not a letter, a text. It said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." I read it once, put my phone down, thought, okay, that is still who she is. And I let her be that person, over there, at a distance, out of my life. It is not a satisfying ending in the way movies want endings to be satisfying. She didn't have a reckoning. She didn't show up on my doorstep in the rain with an apology that changed everything. She sent a text that felt like a door closing quietly from the outside. But here is what I've come to understand, slowly. The hard way. I didn't need her reckoning. I needed mine. I needed to stop waiting for the person who hurt me to be the one who finally made it okay. I needed to make it okay myself. My parents have found their way to something real with me. It's fragile and still under construction, the way things are when you're rebuilding after a long damage. But it's real. They see Clara often. My father built her a toy box, the same way he built Lily's crib, slowly, on weekends, music playing, sawdust on his jeans. My mother sings to her in Spanish, old songs that I remember from my own early childhood, and I sit in the doorway and watch her and feel something that is complicated and layered and ultimately good. We don't mention Kayla when we're all together. It's an unspoken agreement. And sometimes I catch my mother looking at me with an expression that holds guilt and relief and love all at once. And I give her a small nod, and that's enough. That is genuinely enough. Aunt Linda comes to Clara's birthday parties and always brings something slightly impractical and exactly right. Rachel sends voice memos on random Tuesdays just to check in. Daniel's parents fly in from Colorado every few months and spend entire days sitting on the floor with Clara while I watch from the kitchen and feel so full I don't know what to do with it. This is my life now, imperfect, scarred. Sometimes I still reach for Lily's grief the way you reach for an old wound, not because you want to hurt, but because some things become part of you so deeply that they don't stop being there just because time has passed. I look at Clara and I love her completely and fully and without reservation, and in the same breath, I miss Lily with an ache that hasn't changed in shape or size. Both things are true at the same time. I've stopped trying to make them cancel each other out. I want to end by telling you something I've thought about a lot. Forgiveness. People ask about it when they hear stories like this. Did you forgive her? Have you forgiven your parents? Aren't you angry? Here is the most honest answer I have. Forgiveness for me is not something I did for Kayla. It's not a gift I handed to her, or a door I opened for her, or a statement I made about what she deserved. What I did for Kayla, privately, was decide that she was a person I couldn't carry anymore. That's not forgiveness. That's just putting something down. What I did for myself was different. For myself, forgiveness was the slow, daily work of choosing not to let that day, the clink of the glass, the applause, the smile, define the rest of my life. Every time I walked into Clara's room and sat in the rocking chair and breathed, every time I had a full, good dinner with Daniel, where no one's absence cast a shadow, every time I laughed until I cried at something stupid and remembered, oh, I'm still capable of this. This is still mine. That's where I put my forgiveness. Not into Kayla, into the life I rebuilt after her. If you've made it to the end of this, thank you. I know it was long. I know some of it was hard to sit with. If you've ever been the second child in a family that had a favorite, if you've spent years in the quiet role while someone else got the applause, I want you to know that I see you. I know what it costs to be the reliable one. I know how invisible it can feel. And I know that you deserve to take up space too. Full, complete, undivided space. Not what's left over. If you've ever lost a pregnancy or a baby, I see you too. Lily was real. Your loss is real. No one's announcement or excitement or need to be celebrated takes that away. Leave a comment below. Tell me what resonated. Tell me your story. I read every single one. Take good care of yourselves.